Okay, thank you, Asha, for this really inspiring presentation. I think we started out with the motivation for writing this book and the story about the narrative when it comes to Africa. And I can basically attest that based on some of the study we've also done here at Brookings looking at this issue, there's clearly a media bias when it comes to telling Africa's story. We all know media could be inherently biased toward the more negative headline-catching stories, but what we found is that even in Africa's case, it was even more amplified. And it is consequential, because when you also think about what that means for perception of risks, what that means for how risk is priced, and how much is lost, say, in terms of investment opportunities, et cetera. So that certainly resonates with some of the work we've done here. Why don't we then turn to the introduction of our panelists. We're fortunate to really have some experts with different angles on this issue that can weigh in on the conversation. So next to me is Sarah Menker. She's an entrepreneur, founder, and CEO of Grow Intelligence. It's a software company she founded in 2014 to provide intelligence on the weather patterns, trade flows, pricing dynamics, and productions to help users with actionable agricultural data to drive higher productivity and greater access to capital. Prior to launching Grow Intelligence, she was vice president at Morgan Stanley's Commodities Group in New York. Among her accomplishments, she's a young global leader for the World Economic Forum. She's a trustee of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies and a member of the Global Agenda Council on Africa at the World Economic Forum, and a fellow of the Africa Leadership Initiative or Aspen Institutes. And she also serves on the boards of Shining for Hopes, giving back a bit to the community. So thanks for coming. And next to Asha is Julia Ulku. She's a senior economist in the Development Economics Vice Presidency of the World Bank. She co-manages the Doing Business data and report and leads the research on Doing Business unit. So prior to joining the World Bank, she was associate professor in development economics at the Global Development Institute of the University of Manchester in the UK. Research focuses on the effects of innovation, technological transfer, and business regulation on economic growth and productivity. And last but certainly not least is Florie Lieser. She's president and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa. She has a lot of expertise and extensive networks on trade and investment in Africa, and a strong track record of working with private sector to translate policy into action. So prior to leading the CCA, she was assistant U.S. Trade representative for Africa, where, among others, she led the trade and investment policy toward 49 sub-Saharan African countries and oversaw the implementation of AGOA. So if I maybe begin with you, Sarah. So you were in New York, vice president, Morgan Stanley, a good salary, good life. Yet you decided the best thing to do was to return to Africa to start a business. Can you walk us through it? And then in terms of the key messages that you've heard from Masha, how does that resonate with you in terms of your own experience?
Yeah. I now have a good life, but not so good a salary. Started a company, but I think my decision to leave, obviously my job at Morgan Stanley, which was good, and I loved it actually, was driven off the fact that I was born and raised in Ethiopia, and I grew up believing I was an African. I was actually, when I went to college, the first day you enter college and you realize there's not another Ethiopian in your class, you create your African identity from that day. And so I really wanted to move back to the continent and give back in some way at some point. And I reached a point in my career where I had done really well, but I had also needed to make a decision to say, is this what I'm going to continue to do? And that was going to lead me down one path, or do I feel like I'm passionate about something else and I'll figure it out? And I chose the latter. So when I left, there was no business plan. I knew I was passionate about agriculture. I knew I wanted to do something on the continent. And so I just embarked on a journey to figure out what country I'd move to. It didn't have to be Ethiopia, so it ended up being Kenya. And I just did some research and kind of went there and then figured it out. So there was no plan.
Can you help the audience understand a bit better about what your business does and why it was important to be in that space?
Yeah. So we're a software and data analytics company, and what we've really built is an artificial intelligence for understanding global agricultural markets. When I left, the vision for the company was to do this just for Africa. And the reason I did that and the reason we started that journey was because if you think of Africa as a continent, about 63% of the population is in some way related to agricultural markets. Less than 1% of outstanding bank loans have exposure to agriculture. There's a complete mismatch in capital allocation. And the way that you solve a capital allocation problem is by being able to model risk and understand risk profiles. So banks or any type of really risk taker can better allocate capital. And that's what I did at Morgan Stanley. I did it for global energy companies. And I said, we cannot solve the productivity problem until we solve the capital problem. We can't solve the capital problem if we don't know how to assess risk. And so we have to start a company that does that. And that was how it started. But, when you're looking at even building a product for Africa, take something as simple as coffee. You look at, and you want to understand Ethiopian and Ugandan coffee markets, it's impossible to do that without understanding coffee markets in Brazil and Vietnam, without understanding buying patterns from Germany, because Germany is actually buys most East African coffee and green beans and then re-exports exactly those green beans to the rest of Europe. And so are there ways to disintermediate it? And so there's these intricate linkages that just exist inherently across crops, across countries, that it's literally actually impossible to study a single region or a single crop without really thinking about it in that sort of contextualized way.
So were there any time during this journey or process you asked yourself, what have I done? What was those challenges, the main challenge you would say?
Every day.
Every day.
I think there's a couple of challenges, right? One is, like I said, I'm Ethiopian and I still held an Ethiopian passport. And then I moved to Kenya. And the reason I chose Kenya is I had two key criteria for what was important to me at the time. I was self-funding the business, but I knew we would raise capital at some point. So open capital markets was a really important kind of variable. And the second was good technical infrastructure. Again, I didn't know what the product would be or what we would do, but I knew we'd work with data and I needed good technical infrastructure. Kenya was by far the easiest when you needed those two things as your top two criteria. So first step is going and figuring out how to operate in a local environment that you're not from. And then when trying to build an African business, the biggest challenge I had was traveling across Africa with an Ethiopian passport. I can go to Europe, no problem. I have residency in the US. But getting in and out of Tanzania every time was like I was calling somebody and begging for some last minute favor so my visa could be issued on time and I could make it, right? So that was, and Acha's been, really helping with the initiatives around access to visas. The second is capital, raising money as a startup that was focused on Africa. At the time when we did our first raise, we were not global in our mission or our vision, and we were raising for a product in Africa that nobody had ever built. And so, how you pitch that story, who you go to raise money from, is, I think, it's a really big challenge. I think I was incredibly kind of lucky and prepared in the sense that A, like I said, I could self-fund for some time. And B, I left a career on Wall Street. And so my first points of call were the people I said I quit to. They wrote the checks for the company. If I didn't have that, I actually don't know what our trajectory would have actually then become. I think we've been lucky because of that sort of thing. But I would say those are two key challenges.
Wonderful. So it looks like some of the key messages from Asha sort of resonates. Map your strategy. You've looked at it, and Kenya was just the place to be. it will be challenging, and you've been facing challenges. Otherwise, it wouldn't be too rewarding. But it was all worth it.
Yeah.
So then, if I can go to you, Flory, you've also attended the Africa Investment Forum. So
Which
you've
was
had
incredible.
a chance to sort of assess. So as you listen to the strategies that Asha kind of laid out, and as an organization that represents or that works with U.S. corporations, which key messages here quite resonated with you?
So, first of all, just congratulations to Acha and his co-authors for writing this book. I think very timely, kind of given where we are. There are a lot of uncertainties that are kind of out there in terms of U.S.-Africa trade, investment, and relationship, sort of more broadly. But a good time to be looking at how we change the perceptions that businesses have about Africa. And he didn't write it. He and his colleagues didn't write it about the U.S. But I think that the point in terms of U.S., because Corporate Council on Africa has both U.S. and African companies that are members. And some of the people he interviewed, like Aliko Dangote, are actually on my board. And so I think the first point that I want to make, looking at it from this side, is that the things that we hear about from U.S. companies in doing business in Africa, both the triumphs and the challenges, are the same things that impact African companies. And I think that the important thing is that, and it comes through in many of the messages and themes in the book, is that companies doing business in Africa, whoever they are, African, U.S., Chinese, Brazilian, et cetera, really have to look at the continent through, I think, a lens that allows them to see the tremendous potential of Africa and its current contribution and potential contribution to the global economy, as it becomes a greater part of global value chains, and a destination for investment that is rapidly increasing. And I think that from the U.S. side, I know one of the things that CCA is very focused on is really trying to highlight the opportunities and to distill the difference between perceptions of Africa and doing business in Africa versus the reality. So in truth, I think that there are probably perceptions of higher risk than there really are. The other thing that annoys me personally, this is me talking, not necessarily CCA, is some perception of risk in Africa that's different than perceptions of risk in other parts of the world, which have been very tough to deal with. The former Soviet Union area. Lots of people have told us that that's a very difficult area, has been. People who went into China, 30 years ago will tell you how difficult that was. I'm sure there are situations in Latin America, countries in Southeast Asia, which are difficult. I don't know that we should talk about Africa any differently than that. I don't think that's fair or right or accurate. But on the other hand, it is true that what governments do in making it easier to do business, and I know Julia will talk about that, it is critical. And I remember, I love the stories in Acha's book, but I remember many years ago when I was at USTR and took a trip taking a political, we won't name any names, actually in the Bush administration, to Rwanda for the first time. And we had a chance to meet with President Kagame. And one of the things that we raised at that time was the doing business score of Rwanda, which at the time was not very good. And I remember just a small room full of people where he said, well, no, this is not something that, we can't deal with here. And within, I want to say, about 2 years, they went from the ranking that they had, which was in the hundreds somewhere, up to number 32. And so the will of African governments to address, seriously, effectively address the doing business issues is not just beneficial for the local business community, which it should be, but is also beneficial for those who are investing in Africa, and a lot more of that is happening. And again, the U.S. has its own particular story in terms of Africa. It's different than Europe's, the former colonial relationships. It's different than China's, but U.S. companies are there for some of the very same reasons that others are there now. It's a place of incredible opportunity.
Yeah. So we'll get to the doing business part with Julia, but if I may follow up with you. Obviously, there's a big perception, in fact, if we can say reality, that perhaps U.S. is kind of lagging behind in terms of seizing opportunities on the continent, particularly as you compare, say, to China or, for example, to European, perhaps like you mentioned, maybe for colonial reasons. So I guess the question is, currently, what can we expect from the U.S. administrations, maybe this one, maybe the next one, that needs to be done to help facilitate it? Mm-hmm. And in particular, say, the BUILD Act that was just passed, which is going to double the resources to OPIC. Do you see that as an opportunity here that's really going to progress U.S.'s engagement on the continent?
I do, but can I distill what I think is a misperception? There are hundreds and hundreds of U.S. companies that are in Africa. This perception of like where are the Americans, and they're getting their lunch eaten by the Chinese. I actually don't buy that. There are a lot of companies, U.S. companies, that have been there for 60 years, 80 years, 100 years. And then there are lots of new companies that are there, the Googles and the Ubers. And so perception, American companies are in Africa. Now, reality, could there be a lot more? Absolutely. They still represent only, I think, about 1.4% of our foreign direct investment worldwide. So clearly, a lot more could be done. But I do hope that people understand that there are lots of U.S. businesses that are there. And on the point of what the U.S. administration can do, we at CCA were strong supporters, talking to a lot of people about the BUILD Act. I think making it easier for U.S. businesses to engage with their African counterparts on the continent in the ways that other companies can do, sort of leveling the playing field, is very important. And again, not just with the Chinese, everybody talks about the Chinese, but there are a lot of companies from lots of countries that are there. So even the Europeans, the way that their development finance institutions work. I just think that the BUILD Act, doubling the amount of money that OPIC will have, allowing equity loans, and not necessarily tying it to U.S. companies. It'll be a factor, but it won't be the only factor. I think that this is going to help U.S. businesses to engage more effectively on the continent.
Okay, very good. So then, if I can turn to you, Julia. So Florrie touched on doing business environment. So is Africa getting a bad rap on this, or what is the state of play? I know you just work with your colleagues to release not long ago the 2019 edition of Doing Business in Africa. So what is the state of play, and what's been the progress?
Yes, before I go through the findings of Doing Business 2019 on Africa, I would like to congratulate Aka and his co-authors on this incredibly refreshing book. I really enjoyed every page because I have an research interest in Africa, and most of the time I find it hard to find good research studies. What I really liked about the book is that it sets out not only the challenges of Africa in a very realistic way, but it also provides very good and concrete information on the opportunities, I love the phrase that was mentioned in various chapters of the book that's called unmet demand, That's something we don't get to see and read about Africa. There is this, as he pointed out, 50% of African population is below 20, you said, right? It's a very young population, and there is a big demand for all kinds of different products. And therefore, there is a huge opportunity for entrepreneurs. Just one example in the book that I really liked, because I like the anecdotes and the statistics in a specific cases. So in Africa, one outlet, shopping outlet, has 60,000 consumers, whereas in the US, the same number is 400. So this shows that there is a huge opportunity for opening more retail stores. And the book is full of these kinds of examples, which gives you a very good perspective. Coming on to the performance of Africa in doing business, regulatory environment of doing business captured by us through the 11 indicators we use every year. I had a lot of presentations on Africa in different parts of the world, and it's always so, incredible for me to talk about Africa because there is always good news. Since 2012, Africa has been the highest reformers every year. And this year, it broke another record in the reforms with 120 reforms implemented by 44 economies. That's the highest numbers of reform both in Africa and among other regions. So there's also a big increase from the last year, which was 86 reforms performed by 38 economies. This year, we also have 4 African economies in the top 10 improvers in the ease of doing business: Rwanda, Kenya, Togo, and Cote d'Ivoire. Rwanda, as you will know, at least those of you who read the Doing Business reports will know that is the most enthusiastic reformer in the region. And it's also one of the highest reformers in the world. And this year as well, Rwanda was the second highest reformer in the world and the highest reformer in the Africa region, with 7 reforms in 7 different indicators measured by us. And Togo and Kenya, Togo had 6 reforms this year, and Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire had 5 reforms. So what are the, among the 11 indicators we measure what are the areas that the region is focusing in the reforms, right? This changes from year to year. This year, we see that the region focused on improving the legal environment in enforcing contracts. So 27 economies implemented reforms to improve the regulatory environment to shorten or make it more efficient to resolve the commercial dispute. This was mainly the result of the introduction of a new law by OHADA economies that introduced the mediation as another tool to resolve the disputes in a much faster fashion. The other area that the region has focused this year in terms of their reforms, 20 economies reformed and starting a business field. And the reforms mainly focused on decreasing the time to register the business through streamlining the procedures and through introducing online platforms to help the consumers to register their businesses in the comfort of their home or easier than just going to the registration. As my colleagues have mentioned, Africa is very big on digital, improving the digital processing of various transactions, and we see every year big improvements in different indicators in terms of electronization and digitization of the processes. So in terms of the overall performance of Africa in the 11 indicators, we see that the region is performing the best in the in starting a business. Just a moment. And getting credit indicators. 4 of the African economies are in the top 10 globally in getting credit, and these are Kenya, Malawi, Rwanda, and Zambia. And in starting a business, Burundi is 17th in the global ranking. What are the areas that the region has room for improvement? We identified 2 areas from the regulatory point of view, of course, which are getting electricity and trading across borders. So this resonates very closely with what I have read in Anka's book, infrastructure and improving the trade. These areas are very promising for the region to reap up the benefits in terms of their economic growth and development. For getting electricity, just to give you an idea on where this is average. Of course, some economies in the region performs better, some worse, but on average, it costs 3,457% of per capita income in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, to connect to an electricity grid. And the same number at the global average is 1,230% of per capita income. So the governments maybe can focus on improving the costs to connect to the electricity grid. As we know, electricity is one of the most important inputs in production. In terms of trade facilities, the region has been reforming also actively in this field, but there is still a lot of room for improvement. For example, in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, it takes 98 hours to comply with the documents that are required to export and import, and the same number globally is 61 hours. I have, just before I close my comments on the business, I just want to give you a few anecdotes so that to just make it more concrete. This Doing Business report launched in 2003, and since then, during this last 16 years, we see progress in all regions. The poor performers in the regulatory area are converging slowly with the best performers. And we see a lot of examples of this in Africa as well. For example, in Togo, in 2003, it took 74 days to register a limited liability company. Today, it takes only 5.5 days. I mean, imagine an aspiring young entrepreneurs, how much help that will give to that individual, and how much it will impact the registered businesses in the economy. There are a lot of research. There is a lot of research in assessing the impact of doing business regulations on various economic outcomes, but most of these literature focuses on business registry. And they find that making the business registry more efficient improves the formal economy, obviously, but also it improves the employment. It creates more jobs, and also it has an impact on the economic performance. Another example I wanted to give is from Rwanda. Rwanda is the top second economy in the world in registering property, next to New Zealand. And in Rwanda in 2004, it took 370 days to register a simple warehouse with the cadastre. Now it takes only 7 days. So that's a huge saving from the entrepreneur's point of view. In Morocco, in 2005, it took 358 hours to comply with the paying taxes. Now it takes only 155 hours. I have a lot of these kinds of
okay.
examples. You can read it in the report.
And then maybe we'll have a chance
yes.
to come back at it in the Q&A portion. But clearly, progress on doing business reforms that have been sustained, for the past at least a decade and a half, and it looks promising for the region.
Absolutely.
Okay, so maybe I can go to Asha before we turn it over to the audience. So some of the key recommendations you made, as I look at them, some of them may look a bit challenging for small and medium-sized enterprises. We know, as the book also points out, that these are really the innovators, and in terms of employment, and we know Africa can use a lot of employment opportunities that tend to make up for anywhere close to around 80%, 77 to 80% of the new jobs that are created. In particular, in terms of managing the risks, so the idea is to focus on the long term and try to ride the short term volatility. If you are an SME, is it really easy to do, or what do you see as challenges that could be really unique to the SME sector, and how should they adjust their strategy in that context?
No, I think it's a fair question, and I'd love to hear from people who are actually practicing versus consultants like us who share what we think. The answer is. So I think, yeah, for SMEs generally, I think, these are what we've seen companies do well, right? And both, like I said, we've also spent a lot of time talking to some of the SMEs as we're developing, sort of this guidebook for what it takes to win. There's some things that are, more particular to SMEs. I think challenges around riding out the short wave volatility. If you're a big firm and you can sustain, call it short-term losses for longer, then yes, it is easier. Challenges around financing is definitely a big issue that the SMEs face. Challenges around corruption even, right? Is something that, SMEs face probably, more so than large companies. I still think that, the recommendations are the same, across all of these, right? So I think, for an SME, I think critical to really be able to understand who your stakeholders are and who you really need to influence. For me, that's still, very, very, very important. On the short or longer term, I think for an SME, finding a way, and maybe it's a bit harder, but how finding a way to, minimize the impact of these losses, call it, in difficult periods, would be important. I think diversification at the right time, right? At the right time, because then that allows you to, diversify your risk across, whether it's products and services or whether it's across countries. So on the other hand, I think what you find SMEs are more nimble, right? So it's easier for them sometimes and bigger companies to make quick decisions and adjust or change course, based on, some challenges they're facing than you find bigger companies. So I think on one hand, you can argue that it may be a bit harder. On the other hand, I would argue that for some of them, maybe because of the flexibility, it may actually be a bit easier for them to change course. Yeah. I don't know, Sarah, but
how does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the ability to change course faster is definitely a lot easier as a smaller company than as a larger company. I think with regards to, navigating, a lot of countries, for example, have a lot of initiatives around attracting, foreign investment, for example. A lot of those foreign investment bureaus and investment offices are really set up to nurture relationships with large corporates, not with small companies coming to start up, right? So you don't necessarily get the benefit of the incentives that, for example, would exist. They exist for you too, but you have to go find them. They're not kind of handed to you on a silver platter, similar to how it would work with much larger companies. But the benefits actually exist to both, so it's not one versus the other.
That's actually a good point, critical point, to be able to change course.
And then the startup capital issue, I think, I still think it's one of the biggest ones, because there's lots of news and media around, African startups and everything else, but at the end of the day, if it's $50,000 at a time, that doesn't scale, right? So how do you bring, capital with a lot of kind of money behind, like real capital and plenty of capital behind it, so that, you know, African startups are able to raise much larger rounds, so that, you know, you really become competitive on a global landscape. So.
And Julia, in your assessment, that's what you find to be the area where there's been good progress, is access to capital. Did I understand that correctly?
Getting credit, yes.
Getting credit, access.
At the local
Okay.
level. So we measure two sub-indicators there. One is the credit information, where credit bureaus or registries collect information on the, the history, the transaction of the individuals. For example, do they pay their electricity bills, utility bills on time? To me, I think, this is one of the most important indicators for me, because this is very important for very, very small firms, because they don't have enough credit history or anything, because they don't typically get loans from banks. So they don't have any history, so banks don't give them any money. But actually they are very responsible and they will pay back. So how do we get information on those people? Credit scores and the credit information helps a lot. There is also a lot of research on this, how having more information on individuals improve the credit access of those individuals.
If I may, because I think I'd actually differentiate access to credit versus startup capital,
yes.
right? Because I think as you have much more access to credit, and when you're an existing company and you can. But I think one of the big issues we have with more angel investing or venture capital for startups is that if you look at this market, look at Silicon Valley, I think a lot of what has driven that were actually entrepreneurs who made the money and have now started to reinvest and to promote and to support entrepreneurs, right? And I think we need to have an initiative on the continent to get some of our billionaires to do the same, where we heard a number of entrepreneurs who actually made a lot of money, and we just don't see enough of them saying, let me take part of it and reinvest to actually start. I think Tony with Elune is trying to do that with the foundation. That's a different model. And I wonder if there's something where you can, bring all of these, entrepreneurs who've made quite a bit of money together and say, let's figure out how you can put a piece of it to help actually provide startup capital for new businesses, right? And create, a virtuous cycle that way that can then mobilize even more capital into that space.
The other thing people don't talk about is what got Silicon Valley to be Silicon Valley, like the first pool of billionaires, is the US government. I mean, a lot of innovation in Silicon Valley was funded through defense contracts that essentially paid for chips. And the contracts were structured in a way that let failure even happen. So you still, as a company, still made revenue even if you failed, because you still made some innovative milestones. You have no African governments going out and saying, you know what, we're procuring X, Y, or Z, and we actually want African companies to do this, and you get paid for failure. So a huge portion of it initially was subsidized by the US government. And so figuring out the structures that are also created to allow for innovation to happen, where there's startup capital and then there's essentially cushions and mechanisms to protect the capital of billionaires that might start these funds, and that sort of balancing mechanism. So, I mean, defense in the U.S. played a huge role in the creation of Silicon Valley that we know today. So,
I was thinking, though, just on another role that the African governments can play that would support more investment and capital formation on the continent is regional integration. And I know we touched on it, but it's so critical, because there's so many small landlocked economies on the continent, and the need to create more markets that provide for economies of scale and for investment in sort of regional value chains, and efforts that can be done so that Sarah's business in Kenya could be expanded to also make sure that the entire East African community region gets the benefit of what she and her company are doing more effectively. And so regional integration, the formation of the African Continental Free Trade Area is important for Africa, but frankly, let me just end on this point, for companies, especially US companies looking to invest on the continent, they're not going to invest in 55 countries. It's not going to happen. And so if they can invest in, select economies that are critical throughout the continent, North Africa, Southern Africa, East, et cetera, Central, West, and then basically be able to provide their goods and services to a larger market based on those investments, this is going to be really good for them. So again, this is one of those things where something that the Africans are doing and have control over and should have control over will benefit Africa, but it will also be beneficial in terms of how it can facilitate and incentivize investment into the continent from other regions. I can only speak to the U.S., but I'm confident that it's true for all the other countries and regions in the world that are looking at the African market today.
So basically having regional hubs
Yeah.
through which then you can...
Oh my goodness,
proceed.
yes.
Very good. Okay, so we're going to now turn to the question and answers portion, as I promised. So if you could raise your hands and identify yourself. I'll ask you keep it short so we can get in as many questions as we can. And we'll take 3 questions at a time. Yes, the lady in front.
Hi, my name is Val Okarubaisant. I'm a professor at CUA. You mentioned, I have a number of questions, but I guess I will just keep it to 1 or 2. You mentioned access to capital in terms of credit and startups. And you also talked about large businesses. I noticed your, Acha?
Yes.
Yes. I noticed your projector, your PowerPoint had mostly large businesses. And I think you mentioned earlier, the moderator mentioned SMEs. But within the context of looking at large businesses, did you look at, one, the developmental impact question? Because I know the topic here is Africa's untapped and expanding business potential. And what came to mind as we're thinking untapped, when you're talking untapped, you're also thinking within the context of the issue of startups, in terms of capital. As you know, in terms of factors of production, you have labor, capital, infrastructure. In terms of that dimension of Africa, the human capital, can you please comment on what the impact has been with these companies investing in Africa on the human capital? Because as you know, and then the link to that is also, I think, I'm sorry, your name, Sarah. Talked about within the context of that access to capital in terms of finance, long-term sustainability. What are the challenges of most businesses, especially SMEs, going beyond just having initial capital and being able to sustain themselves in terms of financial viability? And also going back to you, the last one, Acha, you talked about dynamism, the importance of dynamism. I think you and Sarah mentioned that. Within the framework of dynamism, can you comment a little bit about your book, especially talked about Africa as a whole, the importance of looking on a case-by-case basis when you're an investor and you're in Africa? Because there's no one-size-fits-all. And how did you apply that within the context of your work, your book? I'm sorry, I haven't read it. Thank you.
It's okay.
But I will.
Yes, the gentleman in the gray suit here.
Yes, I'm Leopold Ekwangale, founding partner of Yahoo Consulting. I've been an entrepreneur in Africa for over 15 years. So I started also my own business, grew it to startup, steel distribution, to construction business, to steel manufacturing. So great story. But what I would like to say is that now I have relocated in the US, helping US companies, of course, to expand to Africa. Even though I have been a victim of what we have not been discussing so much here, which is the governance. Because when a US company wants to invest overseas, the first question that's coming up all the time is the risk factor. I understand that for your presentation, you first wanted to, depict the good side of Africa, and I agree on that. There's a lot of potential. But for an investor who is not a big investor like GE, Coca-Cola, these people, these type of companies, they know about how to deal with risk. But the small and medium-sized U.S. company, if we want to attract more companies to come to Africa and invest, we need to address and give more information about the risk factor. And the biggest risk factor is not the administrative side, like reducing the number of days for creating a business, is the governance side, the rule of law. How businesses are protected in Africa, what has been improvement in terms of if you have a conflict with a local partner, with a government official, how you're going to be, having your business being expropriated without not being compensated. So those are the main things that we should be addressing in such a forum to make sure that people understand that there's an improvement in protection or where there's the improvement and how they should be taking the risk to go over there because the investment will be, made safe. The final thing that I want to say is that concerning the media, I understand, I would like to defend the media, but the role of the media is not to praise what's going on in Africa. I remember that 30 years ago, I was studying in Paris, and the only pictures we used to have in France 30 years ago about China were just people dying of starvation. They were just talking about China, the big starvation, famine going on there. No one was talking about the tremendous transformation that was going on at that time already in China. So to remain fair, we should not be expecting any praise for the international media. Africa should just be working, bringing on changes, and the change concerning the government is a very critical one for the investors because I've been through that. You can have a very good, a bright story of business development and still end up with having problem with local government officials. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Yeah.
Hi, I'm actually Rosalind Donald, and I'm probably going to piggyback on what the professor said here a little bit. And my question is for Sarah. How were you able to navigate capital acquisition at the beginning, the infancy stage of your startup? And was it local, was it foreign, was it domestic? And how do you continue to generate the revenue, knowing that your company probably needs to innovate some more, to develop more revenue, and to stay sustainable? And for Acha, does McKinsey inject capital into small startups like that of Sarah, or do you just deal with... No.
That's an easy answer.
They just take on money.
We advise. Maybe we'll come back to that.
Right. Or is it just large and medium-sized organizations? And those are my questions.
Okay, we'll turn it to the panelists for this round. Looks like Asha, most questions went to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer a few. So the professor, on impact on human capital, yes. So the book didn't focus just on that. Like I said, there's a whole chapter on talent, right? And both on what these companies have done, but actually doing impact to actually groom talent that they needed, how they have done to actually source that talent, and what, if you're going to build such a company, you need to do to make sure you can actually identify and grow the talent in Africa. So that's really the focus that we're in the book. We've done a lot more research on job creation, where it's going to come from, that kind of stuff. We're happy to talk about it. But the group was really focused on, if you're going to build a sustainable business, how do you actually source that talent and how do you grow it? On the question of dynamism, I totally agree. We talk about Africa, but it's 54 countries, right? And if you look at our Lions on the Move 1 report that we put out 8 years ago now, at the time, what was happening, growth, everywhere you looked, there was growing. So every single country in Africa at the time was growing, positive. And if you look at the 30 economies that account for 97% of Africa's GDP, 25 of those 30s had accelerated the growth relative to the 80s. So there was growth everywhere. So countries were, as a country, you can go anywhere, you'll find growth and you'll do well. Fast forward to 2 years ago when we put out the Lions on the Move 2 report, what we found that only 13 out of the 30 economies had accelerated the growth. and it was much more nuanced, right? And if we have a whole matrix you have in the book on growth and stability, and you'll find three groups of countries, very, very different. And so then the implication, and for many of our clients, was you have to be much more nuanced. This is just on the country, how you select countries you want to go into, but even on the sector, right? So definitely the dynamism is exciting, but the reality is 54 countries, and it's you have to be much more discerning there. On the risk, part of the issue is, I think, like I said about the New York Times article, what we hear is always about these guys who had, something expropriated and all, and that's wrong, and governments shouldn't do that. But what we find were amazing companies like Sarah's and many others who are there building businesses, and they're going to scale it, right? And we have a number of these examples, PAGA, we have MCOPA, we have Jumia that's doing well, we have, the Africa Leadership University, we have, Grow Intelligent, Babanguna. We just found amazing companies who, despite all this risk and the challenges with the rule of law and the challenges with governance and the challenges with funding, are figuring it out, right? And it's not easy, and we don't claim that it's easy, but what we wanted to highlight were actually these companies who are doing it to hopefully encourage others to say these are some challenges, but you can learn from people who are dealing with it on a day-to-day basis and actually building something significant, right? So that really was the focus, versus trying to identify the people who are struggling or who've been expropriated, because that turns up in the papers all the time. So we had a bit of a different focus. And I guess just your question, as McKinsey, we actually don't invest, whether it's in big or small companies. We provide advice to companies. They tend to be on the larger end of the scale, but increasingly now we're doing more and more for smaller companies as well.
Take the capital question.
Yeah. So, in terms of the question around where have we gotten our capital, how much of it is local versus international, it's all international. It's all outside of the continent. And so, our strategy was to basically say we have a vision and we believe that we can build a defensible technology product in Africa, and opened an office in Nairobi, hired software engineers, and took the journey from there. Since then we've been able to raise $30 million, and it's been from investors that range from US-based individual investors to some really large venture capital funds to Israeli and Asian investors. So we really, we've gone everywhere, and you have to find people who are okay with it. We're global as a company now, so we actually have clients around the world. We're not, dependent on the African market. And in fact, Africa, in terms of sales, is the smallest portion of our business now. It's highly diversified, right? And so I think we're a story of a company that was started in Africa that's become global, that people don't even talk about. And then we're a technology company. So I think it's not easy, but it's very doable. I think we do a terrible job of maybe talking about it. I'm not very good at going out and saying this is what we've done. And it's mostly because there's so much more to build, right? I think in terms of risk of government, we operate an office out of New York and an office out of Nairobi. We're now spending a lot more time mitigating our immigration risk in the US by literally actually moving people to Nairobi on a temporary basis as we deal with all this immigration crap here. So I just have to say, we deal with government issues in Nairobi too, but I never thought a day would come where I'm talking to employees and I'm like, hey, this process is delayed just in case. Are you okay with moving to Nairobi for the next 6 to 12 months as we figure it out? And people are okay with that, right? So there's also that, which is we have people sitting in New York where they say, no problem, if my visa doesn't come through, I'll move and relocate to Nairobi and I can go work there and life is okay. So there's, not to say it's easy, but it's not easy here either.
Yeah. You got government risk everywhere. Maybe we have time for just a couple of more questions and then we'll close. Yes, lady in the back.
Hi, my name is Lisa Briggs, and I actually work for the Department of Defense, which is an interesting introduction because the question has nothing to do with defense. I heard in the book presentation that you conducted interviews, which made me feel good, and the anthropologist in me is hearing culture. And so my question to anyone who wants to answer it is, where is culture in growth, Africa Growth Initiative, business models, and such?
Thank you. Dave Rabinowitz, I'm retired. And my question really is very similar to the last one in that, you know, there's an old saying, a man with one watch knows what time it is. A man with two watches is not so sure. Similarly, a person who knows one way to live knows how to live. Most of us know how to live, but there's more than one way. And our consumer society, where you're expected 5 days a week to get out, leave your home and family, spend 8 hours doing something you'd rather not do just to survive, is not the only way to live. I mean, when I was living in Africa many years ago, the people around me were living on maybe $100 a year, but they weren't poor. They were living, in Sarah's words, a good life, not so good a salary. And basically, my question is it reasonable to try to export our questionable consumer society to the people of Africa and impose it on them?
Who wants to take the last question?
That side hasn't answered yet.
Maybe it'd be easier if we start with the first question and then we work on with the second
I'm not sure that's easier either. On culture, I mean, I'm not sure, I don't know if I'm going to answer directly, but I'm starting to make some of those interviews available online, right? So I'd encourage you to just, you know, go through them. Because, you know, it's back to, you know, and we interviewed them, it was more to understand a bit their experience in building a business in Africa and what really matters. I think the cultural element that came through is, again, for me, is this mindset of all of them were this idea of, you know, we're doing it because it's the right thing to do, right? We're doing it because we want to make a difference on the continent. We're doing it because we want to provide products and services that don't exist today. We're doing it because we want to help improve people's lives. And you heard about what Strive said too. We're not, you know, and we're going to make money there, right? So I think if I contrast that to other regions, it was a very much of a coming at it from you know, a bigger purpose in making a difference on the continent, on the back of which you'll do well, and many of them do very, very well, right? So I mean, that's a bit that's also on the cultural front that came out of these interviews, was the different way to approach doing business on the continent. On the consumer society, I mean, I think we can all have a debate about, you know, what is the right thing for for the continent. You know, we focus on you know, the businesses, right, and what it would take to grow that, and then it means that, you know, we're driving a bit of this behavior. But you know, I don't think the answer for the continent is let's try a whole different model at the expense of what exists today, right? You know, maybe it's trying both models, but given in the midst of what exists today, this is a bit what we focused on.
Can I just add just one thing on that too? I just think it's important that Africans decide what they want and what the model is that's right for them, and that people on the outside, you know, I remember when people were marching and saying, you know, no globalization in Africa. I said, did anybody ask the Africans about that? I mean, you know, whether or not they wanted to be left behind or be a part of the global economy. So I would just say that your question is a good one, but I think the answer has to come from the Africans.
Can I add on that?
Yes, certainly.
Consumerism. Yeah. I think the question of consumerism is not region specific, it's global. You know, because every individual has instantaneous access to everything. So they demand. When they see that people use iPhone here, they want iPhone too. It's out of our control. So if we need to address the consumerism at the global level, I think, you know.
All right, so with this, we'll...
I thought,
yes, go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Can you give a less diplomatic answer?
Yes, please.
You know, I always worry when I hear statements like that. And the reason I do is that in a desire to battle the maybe ultra-consumer culture that exists in the US, the question becomes, should we drive Africans in that direction, right? And it's not really an either or, because to me, it's, you know, when you're dealing with basic economic growth, I mean, it's a debate like in my world, which is food and agriculture. the constant fight I have is with people trying to pitch me that like alternative proteins and, you know, non-meat meat is going to like replace meat consumption, and so Africans should eat meat and less meat and now go into eating, you know, plant-based proteins. And it's there's this, I think there's a struggle, and it's, yes, a good life is good, but we should strive for more. And I think what Acha's maybe in some of the examples he gave is just about what that more is. I think that more and what the construction of more is gets determined by Africans, but we certainly need the $100 a year to go up to $100,000 a year. Why not dream for that? Like, you know, like we should. What that's made up of, we'll figure out later, but we should absolutely not be okay with a content life.
Okay, so with this, we'll go to the, apologize not having had a chance to get to everybody who had a question. So if they will go to the panelists if they have like some quick 30-second to 1 minute closing remarks. And then, and remember, after this, Asha is going to move to the front desk to begin signing autographed copies of the books for you. So Sarah, any concluding remarks?
I think I made my
concluding
remarks.
Okay, Flory? Yeah.
I had one thing that I like that Acha said, but maybe one of the few things I might disagree with. Sure. He talked about doing good to do well. And I'm always telling people, at least here in the U.S., that don't get it confused. U.S. companies are not in Africa to do good. They may do good coincidentally while there, but they are in Africa to do well. And so people need to understand that there is a bottom line for many companies, U.S. and otherwise, but I'm just going to speak for U.S. for the moment, and they're there to do well, and the more that they do well, then the greater chance they have to do good. So we flipped it a little bit, you and I. I agree with your point, but I'm just sharing that for a lot of companies, they're not there. That's not their major goal. But we do hope that they will do good things while they're there doing well.
I think my point is only if they don't do good things and only focus on doing well,
they would not do well.
It's not sustainable.
Yes, no, and I agree with that.
Julia, any concluding remarks?
Sure. 2 points that overlap between our results and Acha's results is that more investment and reforms in infrastructure and the trade field. I think that's the area where there is a lot of gain for the region. And infrastructure, for obvious reasons, electricity is very important, and the stability and the supply of it is the key for growth. And on trade, you know, obviously Africa has a lot of different regional trade areas, but a trade bloc will really help the region in terms of not only increasing the market, but also diversifying the trade and increasing the value added of the production.
Asha?
No, for me, I'd say, you know, thanks for coming. I'd say join the conversation, Africa BizRev, and let's continue to grow these baobabs on the continent.
All right, so wonderful. So you've heard it from the most experienced people on business, doing business in Africa. There's tremendous opportunities. They're growing. The business environment obviously continues to be work in progress in Africa like elsewhere. And as you heard from Julia, the continent has also been doing great in that area in terms of progress. But I always like to remind people in development economics the premise that we need to have the best environment, to have first-rate environment, first-rate institutions before the development process can begin, I think has it backward. No country has ever started with the best institutions or the best environment. It's a dynamic process. And it's good to know that Africa is indeed making good progress, although there are clearly areas where they can do more catch-up and then sustain that progress going forward. So thanks a lot for coming and joining the conversation. It was really fascinating. I know there are many other areas we haven't had a chance to get to, like the creative industries. When I heard the issue about culture, the movie industry, the fashion industry, etc., or the continental free trade area, what that means for the business opportunities. But we have to save something for next time, right? So stay tuned. And thanks a lot, Asha. Yeah.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.